I would now like to introduce Nick van Westenholt. This is the second Zoom talk that Nick's done. Nick is Director of Trade and Business Strategy with the National Farmers Union. The last time we listened to Nick, he was still with the National Farmers Union, but then he was Director of EU Exit and International Trade. Brexit just happened some 2 months ago, and Nick will brief you how well or how not well things are working. But before Nick speaks, I would just like to congratulate the National Farmers Union, and Nick is very much part of this, in the very effective lobbying of government that they partook in over the last couple of years. So Nick, I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I was just checking my diary back when it was that I spoke to you last, which was September. So still a few months out from when we finally left what was called the transition period, because of course we actually left the EU in January last year. But while we were in the transition period and seeking a deal, things pretty much stayed the same. And thinking back to September, I mean, I don't have a recording of what I said to you, but I know sort of vaguely what the outlook was then and how we were sort of looking at the weeks in front of us. And it felt then in September that the clock was ticking pretty hard, that there was probably a couple of months maximum for the UK and the EU to try and secure a deal. And if not, time would run out, and by sort of mid-November, that would probably be it all done. And you might even remember the Prime Minister, I think he had an original deadline in the summer, and then he sort of said October. So certainly we felt things were getting too close to comfort back then. And very much our view, my view as well, was that a deal was critical. And I'll just explain in a second briefly the differences between the deal and no deal, and why a deal was so critical. And I think I would have spelt a little bit of that out last time. But you know, it then turned out that the timing we sort of were looking at was wrong. Everybody was wrong, because of course it really did go up to the wire. Christmas Eve was when a deal was eventually announced. And I have to say, I was always of the opinion that ultimately a deal would be done, but that opinion got pretty shaky towards the end as the clock ticked on. And certainly into sort of mid-December, I certainly felt it was 50-50 at the very least. So the deal certainly came to us in the NFU, in the farming sector, as a relief, because the implications of no deal were particularly damaging for farming. I think they would have been damaging for the economy more broadly, but particularly damaging for farming. And that's because the main difference between a deal and no deal would have been the imposition of tariffs on trade between the UK and the EU. So up until the end of last year, all trade between the UK and the other 27 EU countries is completely frictionless, completely free, completely smooth. Selling goods to somebody in France or Germany or in Greece is pretty much as easy and straightforward, or was as easy and straightforward, as selling goods to somebody in the Midlands, the West Country, wherever. No real obstacles of any sort. The absence of a deal would have meant suddenly tariffs charged on most goods being traded, not all certainly, but most goods being traded, in particular food products and agricultural goods. Now, in world trade, the big tariffs are on food and agricultural products. That's where they sit. It's just a feature of the fact that countries all over the world have not wanted to liberalize their agricultural markets as much as they've been happy to in other sectors of the economy. So tariffs exist on most agricultural goods. And if we had left without a deal, then we would have treated the EU, and the EU would have treated us like any other country around the world and suddenly charged tariffs. Now that would have been things like 80% tariff on beef, 45% on sheep, on lamb, and we sell a lot of lamb to the EU, 50% on barley. We grow barley, a lot of barley this part of the world, 50%. These are sort of figures that make actually that trade almost impossible. They suddenly impose massive costs on trade. So if overnight we had been facing those sort of tariffs, it would have been really problematic. And so thankfully, the deal meant that there's 0 tariffs across the board on EU-UK trade, which is unique. There's no trade deal in the world that does that, actually. So that was a huge relief. Other than that, though, there's not really much in the deal. It's a pretty hard Brexit. And I'll now go on and sort of talk about what the impacts of it are and what the implications of it are. But before I do, the only other aspect of the deal which I would say was a good thing, or why getting a deal was so important, is because it's created, at least in theory, a basis for the EU and the UK to continue to cooperate and work together and try and work out issues as they arise in the relationship. If there had been no deal, then I think the relationship would have been so acrimonious, the two sides would have been so angry with each other, that all the issues that are already arising and which will arise in future would have been left to fester, and nobody really would have been willing to try and resolve them. And that would have created a lot of angst and anger, and it would have failed to resolve the problems we're seeing. Now, as you've probably detected, the relationship between the UK and the EU over the last couple of months has been fairly strained at times anyway, particularly, for example, the kind of row about the vaccine and the EU's threat to block trade into Northern Ireland to protect their vaccine supplies, which thankfully they rescinded very quickly. But there is already some difficulties in that relationship which are bound to continue. But actually, what is less visible but is going on behind the scenes are lots of discussions between civil servants on the EU and the UK side to try and resolve the very technical issues that are already arising in the relationship, and trying to make trade flow a little bit more freely, not much to be honest, but a little bit. And that will be important. So I think that is a good reason to have a deal. Very simply, the sides are continuing to talk, and they haven't sort of all thrown their toys out the pram and walked away and taken their ball home type behavior. But other than that, it's a very thin deal. The UK, primarily because the UK wanted to strike a very thin deal, but the UK has chosen to have a relationship with the EU, which is just like any other non-EU country that doesn't have basically a trade deal. Other than those 0 tariffs, we have no better relationship with the EU than any other country. Indeed, in some instances, quite a thinner, weaker relationship. I'll give an example. What we face now on trade is lots of checks, lots of documentary evidence required for all trade into the EU. For farming, that's particularly burdensome. So, for example, all products, what we call products of animal origin, so that's meat products, eggs, dairy, anything that started its life from or as an animal, basically. So that's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of food. All of that now has to have something called an export health certificate if it's going to be sold into the EU. So if you sell a ham sandwich into the EU, that has to have an export health certificate signed by a vet. That's what any other non-EU country has to face trading into the EU. So if you have a van full of different things, some cheese, some pork, some egg products or whatever, going into the EU, as happens a lot, or certainly happened a lot, each one of those items will have to have an export health certificate signed by a vet, which makes trade much more expensive and much more burdensome. It also potentially, on all of that trade into the EU, not just has to have those documentary requirements, but will have to, up to 30% of that trade will be physically checked by border control. Now, the New Zealanders, and this is why I was saying we have a thinner relationship, New Zealanders came to a deal with the EU some time ago, what's called the Eu Veterinary Agreement, which has reduced checks on EU trade on animal products to the EU to 1%. So basically, if you're a New Zealand sheep farmer, you're in a better position now if you're sending your sheep into the EU than if you're a Welsh sheep farmer. Much less checks, much less requirements, and much less cost and much less friction. Now, there is a prospect over the next few years that we can try and negotiate something similar. And we can reduce those checks, which will make trade easier, reduce the costs on sheep farmers, for example. But not at the moment. And that's the journey we have now set ourselves on. So what we're seeing now, because of those sorts of examples, is quite a lot of increased cost on trade with the EU. Big companies are generally going to be all right. They've got enough resources, they can throw money at getting people in the jobs to deal with this, that actually that extra cost in trade is probably manageable. And we generally, with those big companies, we're seeing that they're taking a little bit of a hit with trade, but not too much. It's the small traders we're really seeing suffering. So, for example, we have some members in the NFU who are small artisanal cheese makers. They sell cheese all across the UK and into the EU, or they did. And most of that, they would have just sold single cheeses, and they would have used a company like DHL or something like that, the sort of delivery companies we're all familiar with, to sell packages. And they could just ring up DHL, get the right packaging and give it, and that would just be taken straight into the EU or the home market. Those companies aren't taking those anymore because of the issue I've just mentioned. That cheese now has to have an export health certificate. DHL would have to be responsible as they arrive in the EU with the cheese to make sure it has the export health certificate with the veterinary signature on it. So they're not interested. And those sorts of small companies now are beginning to really struggle. We've seen, I'm sure you've all seen the problems with the shellfish sector, lots of the fishing sector indeed. The pork industry is another one who have found some issues, although many of those are much more related to other issues other than Brexit, to be honest. There's some broader issues around the pork sector at the moment. But we've seen issues actually in most areas of farming where small companies are struggling to trade with the EU in the way they did. And it's not a surprise. This is not a problem in a sense, or this is not an unintended consequence. We get a lot of calls from farmers and others saying, well, I can't now sell into the EU, I can't trade, or it's too expensive, we need to sort this out. And the point is, this is a design of the system. This is what the Brexit that we have chosen leads to. It is a clear decision to have left the customs union and the single market and to accept, therefore, that these barriers will rise. As I say, I think some companies will be absolutely fine with that, but smaller companies in particular might or are already struggling. And in particular, this is happening because the UK has a trading relationship with the EU, unlike any other country. If you're the US trading into the EU, you will tend to send over large consignments of single types of products, and much more packaged up, so that actually the burdens of the forms and the requirements, etc., are much simpler. You may only have to meet 2 or 3 of those sorts of requirements. Whereas the UK has a relationship with the EU in a trading sense, much more like it's our home market. You send small consignments, mixed consignments, grouped consignments, etc. If you run a supermarket in the UK, you might also have a supermarket in Northern Ireland, and you'll send a truck over with all sorts of different products. That model doesn't work anymore. So we will see probably a restructuring of some of the food sector in the UK. The model that our economy is based on, just in time, small consignments, that sort of thing, isn't suited now to our new relationship with our largest market. So we're going to have to adapt. There's going to have to be a new way of doing things. Some companies may thrive, others will almost certainly not, and could well go under. But that is where we are. Now, That's the kind of cost side, and I've been quite straight there. That is a negative impact ultimately. So why did we choose this Brexit? It was absolutely 100% a choice of the government to go for that, even if, I'm afraid, to be frank, the Prime Minister denied these things would happen. And I haven't even talked about Northern Ireland, but I'm happy to pick up if anybody's got questions on that. But this is absolutely 100% the active choice of the government to have this relationship. Well, the reason was, of course, sovereignty. And this is interesting. So a hard Brexit, a very thin relationship with the EU in order to take back control of our laws. And to give credit to the UK negotiators, they achieved that. And they achieved that in a way that actually, I think some commentators believe they wouldn't be able to. So we don't have what was called dynamic alignment, for example, which was the suggestion that even though we weren't a member of the EU, we would have to follow all the rules and regulations of the EU still, even though we had no say in the way they were decided or made. You know, that would have really, I think, been the worst of all worlds. We would have been the rule taker without any decision-making aspects. But that hasn't happened. We genuinely have now the ability to create our own rules, to fashion our own laws in the way that we want. But there are a couple of quite big caveats on that. Firstly, if we do come up and create new rules, new laws, new regulations primarily, so this might be, for example, the specifications of machine parts, or it might more likely and relevant to farming be the way that pesticides are regulated, what pesticides we can use in the UK, which might not be for use in the EU, chemicals more broadly, or it might relate to environmental protections, pollution controls, those sorts of things. If we decide to do things differently, that then may mean that the EU raises further barriers, imposes tariffs, for example, on trade in related products. So as an example, one that I'm familiar with, Gordon will be familiar with it. If the EU were to ban a certain pesticide, beforehand, of course, that would mean it would be banned in the UK. It may be now the UK decides, no, our safety assessment says this is safe and doesn't need to be banned. And the EU does have a bad reputation across the world for being way too precautionary on these things and banning them when there's not even really a good deal of evidence that they may cause harm. So the EU is a sort of outlier globally on that. There will be a temptation for the UK to do things differently. But if we do that, if we were to hold on to a well-known pesticide like Roundup, glyphosate, many people use that for weed control, even in their gardens. It's used in farming as well. If the EU were to ban that, we were to keep that, then the EU might decide to impose tariffs on trade in grain, wheat, barley, if it's been grown using those pesticides. So there's a decision to be made in that for the UK as it uses this new sovereignty. If we can go out and do these things on our own now, which, as I said, was well secured by the negotiators. But if we do things differently, there might be a cost. What's really interesting is that the government, you know, this was the real reason they fought so hard in negotiations. This was their bottom line. They must retain sovereignty. I think the surprising thing since the beginning of the year has been that there's no obvious secret plan of the government's what it was going to do with the sovereignty that it's fought so hard to retain. So the Prime Minister turned around in the middle of January and said, right, business, tell me, how do you know, what do you want? What regulatory reform do you want? What do you want us to do with this newfound sovereignty? I think a lot of businesses were very surprised by that. They presumed that the UK had fought so hard for it, there was a sort of plan. It seems there isn't. And maybe even more interestingly, many of the businesses, so when I'm with my NFU hat on, I often go into meetings with other trade associations, so other organizations representing other bits of the economy. So you might have the bankers, pharmaceutical sector, the tech sector, food and drink, all sorts of others. Most of those sectors don't really have any desire for regulatory reform or to move away from the current regulations they operate under, the EU type regulations, because they've invested significant money over a long time to adopt these regulations. They've already sunk money into it. Changing it would be just to sort of throw that investment out the window. It would also mean they were no longer maybe conforming to the requirements of some of their big markets in the EU. You meet those standards because that's what your customers want. So why would you diverge? So there is a big question mark now what we do with this new sovereignty. But there may be some areas, funnily enough, they probably do relate to food and farming more than others, but they might be the sorts of things people don't like the sound of. For example, pesticide regimes, which allow greater use of pesticides, or gene editing in plant breeding, so bringing in sort of genetic modification, these sorts of things, biotechnology. So it's a bit of a kind of head scratcher as to what is going to happen with these newfound freedoms. And there is there's been other suggestions, for example, employment rights, labor laws. Again, though, it's difficult to see the UK government wanting to reduce, in an advanced economy like the UK, reduce the rights that workers have in a significant way. It seems unlikely. Nevertheless, this is where I think the big question mark sits now, and what we'll all be waiting to see. What is going to be the UK government's direction of travel? How is it going to use its newfound sovereignty in a way that makes it all worthwhile? We've got some short-term friction going on at the moment. Some companies really struggling, but in the long term, it's more difficult to say what the government's going to do. I would say a couple of points about the here and now. Firstly, it's quite difficult to assess exactly what the impact of Brexit has been because of the pandemic. Now, we can see that trade flows are down quite a lot. So the amounts of lorries, etc., moving over the channel, going under the Channel Tunnel, etc., into the EU, has only just about now picked up to where it normally would be at this time of year. But it's not a normal year by any stretch of the imagination. So we don't really know whether Brexit is having a big impact or not. We can see individual problems arising. But if you look at food prices, farm gate prices of cereals, wheat, barley, the price of red meat, of lamb, etc., they're all pretty good, actually. Not across the board, but many of those sectors are doing okay. I would say, contrary to what we expected there to be a downward pressure on prices from Brexit now. But actually, that's probably largely because of the pandemic, where supermarkets are doing a pretty good job, actually, of sourcing from UK farmers at the moment. Obviously, it's supermarkets who are kind of enjoying a bonanza, as nobody's able to eat out. Everybody's buying all of their food from supermarkets. And in some sectors, red meat being one, they are buying a lot of red meat from UK farmers. So there is an outlet there, not again across the board. And pork, for one, is one we're seeing a lot of European imports of, but it's difficult to discern at the moment what the impact is, because it's such an unusual period of our lives, unlike any other, which I think we all know and feel. The second issue is all of the things I've just talked about only relate to UK-EU trade. These checks that I'm talking about, the documentary requirements, the veterinary signatures, etc., are all done at the EU end on stuff we're sending over. The UK government decided not to apply the same controls immediately, primarily because it wasn't prepared, didn't have the infrastructure or the people to do it. It's going to start bringing these in from the beginning of April, and then properly fully from the beginning of July. So that might start having an impact more on the public, on consumers, on shop prices, etc. All of the stuff we're seeing at the moment is just companies who are trying to sell stuff into the EU. As UK consumers and the UK public, we're not really seeing that. But come April, come July, the UK is going to start having exactly the same requirements on EU trade, and that could start having some big impacts. So in a way, I'm just saying, watch this space, and don't presume that it's sort of, we're over the storm. There's a couple more humps, I think, to get through. But I would hope that in the longer term, if I was talking to you this time next year, that the issues we're seeing arising now, the problems that people are having with trade, will reduce quite significantly as companies get used to what they're required to do, as they get used to the new paperwork. They probably need to employ 1 or 2 more people to handle it, etc. That actually those companies who are able to do that will be fine, and lots of those issues will just become the cost of doing business. It'll put a little bit of cost on everything they do, but it will almost certainly be manageable for many. Those companies, I'm afraid, who are struggling a lot at the moment probably will have gone down by then in any case. So sort of in the longer term, I think it will be manageable. But as I said, it's probably going to require some significant, or certainly for the industries and the companies involved, significant restructuring to deal with the new, very, very different relationship we now have with the EU. And that is not, by the way, it's not going to suddenly change. There's sort of ideas that we're going to go back to the negotiating table and get rid of lots of these problems. That really is not going to happen. So the final point I would say, well, then, that sounds a bit grim. And to be honest, we have decided to do something which no country in the world has ever done, which is to erect very significant trade barriers overnight with our largest trading partner. Indeed, actually, what we've really done is put a wall down the middle of our home market and cut off 9/10 of our home market, what was our home market, overnight. So I'm not going to kind of dress that up. That is going to have some serious impacts. But what about the rest of the world? And you hear a lot about this. We're doing trade deals with the rest of the world, and these are interesting. And I do think there is a new appetite which hasn't existed in the UK for a long time to trade better, to trade more, to do a lot more with countries around the world. We're negotiating trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada and Mexico will be coming next. You may even have seen that we've applied to join something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, despite its name, geography is no barrier to joining that. It is, at the moment, 11 countries on the Pacific Rim, like Australia, Japan, Malaysia, Chile, Canada, Mexico. So it's just countries around the rim, but there's no reason a non-Pacific country can join. And we've applied to do that. So I do think there's some interesting opportunities. I think there's an appetite, as I say, which hasn't existed before, to grow trade with other countries around the world, and to export more and export better. So for companies really willing to try and take advantage of that, I think there's going to be some interesting opportunities. But there's no economic analysis in the world which suggests those trade deals and those new trade relationships will come anywhere close to making up for the potential loss in trade from the EU, which is a concern. And the oddest thing about this all, I think, is the rhetoric we hear from the government about free trade. The Brexit part of it was about leaving the EU, leaving the sort of protectionist wall of the EU, and embracing free trade again. The reality is it's the opposite. The UK has interestingly taken a very protectionist step and has erected trade barriers with its largest market, and it's difficult to see how that fits with a lot of the messaging we hear. To finish off, I think, in truth, and it's something I've said all along, that ultimately the impacts of Brexit will probably be not as bad as the doom mongers and gloomsters, as the Prime Minister would call them, fear. but it's also not going to be the sunlit uplands and great benefits that many of its adherents promised. It'll be somewhere in the middle. My personal view is it'll be modestly, over a period of time for the UK economy, more negative than positive. That is generally what most economists, but not all, think. Many, not many, some still believe that it'll be modestly advantageous. But ultimately, the UK will survive and in many ways thrive, and will get through it. And for some companies and some people out there, they will probably find great benefits from it, as these major changes often lead to. So we'll continue to keep an eye on things as they move forward, and fingers crossed that it's not going to be as bad as I've just told you all it is. So on that note, Gordon, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm sure you're happy to take questions.
Very happy, yes.
Right. Stephen Mustall. You need to unmute yourself, Steve. Steve, you need to unmute yourself.
I have done, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I have agreed with considerable amount, virtually 90% of what you said. I'm very much aware of what's happened. We know that I was in banking, so I'm particularly worried about the passporting thing and jobs like being lost in the city, which is a big taxpayer to this economy. So apart from that, one thing I wanted to ask you, and from your perspective, because I've discussed this with people in my ex-business, is the fact is that we tended to vote emotionally about retention of our own laws, taking control back again, immigration. These were the big factors that pushed a considerable number of people and just pushed us into the voting to leave. Yet when we came to look to the EU's response, we expected it to be economic. Oh, they'll do a deal with us because they want to sell us things. They want to sell. They want to do. Why didn't we think of that? Or why weren't we ever aware or believe we were aware that they have their own political, we're on our, we have a social and political stance, not just an economic one. We're not the only ones with the statehood and, flag flying. Other countries have got that as well. And as soon as we sort of rattled the cage there, we saw it come back at us, and you look at Macron and you look at the other people and they've thrown this back at us. And I think that's possibly where it happened. I don't know how you see that. I'd like to know what your point of view is on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I think you're right. There's always been very clear that there's been two aspects, actually, as you say, on both sides of the whole Brexit issue, the political and the economic. And from the UK side, the political has overridden and trumped the economic almost at every turn. And I don't think it's controversial to say, if you looked at this purely through an economic lens, purely through an economic prism, you would not have ended up anywhere near where we've ended up. We've ended up here because of politics, as you say, issues such as sovereignty, immigration, etc. And look, there are reasons people want to, believe those are important and want to pursue that, and that is, of course, perfectly legitimate. But it is the trumping of the politics over the economics that has got us where we are. In which case, my point would be, well, that's fine. Don't then complain that the economics look bad, because that was always going to be the cost, and the economics now do look bad. But as I say, there are some political advantages, for example, around sovereignty. But if we want to exercise that political advantage, it might have further economic costs. The other point you make is a good one as well, which I think was overlooked, which is the political interests of the EU. There is no interest for the EU in making Brexit look like a success. Now, a lot of the press will then turn around and say, well, that, reasons we should leave, and this is terrible behavior from them. Well, look, it's politics. It's, we're all doing the same. Britain are playing the same game. Everybody's at it. So yeah, I don't think the way the EU have behaved sometimes during negotiations has been particularly good. And I think, the way they've behaved recently actually has been has been pretty bad around the vaccines. They've not covered themselves in glory at all. Reminds us actually why, you know, the EU is far from perfect. It's exactly the vaccine experience reminds us precisely of that. But you know, we've made mistakes, they've made mistakes, and we've ended up now in this very difficult situation where I think politics will continue to trump economics, and that is a concern, because when it comes to economics, we're talking about livelihoods, jobs, all these issues. So I think your assessment is basically right, and from my perspective, I think it's been a shame that all along the economics has been trumped by the politics.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Nick. Ian Priest.
Yes, Nick. Like Stephen, I go along with everything you say, and respond with gloom and despair at the unforced errors, if you like. But where it seems to me that our politicians have led us astray is above the political level, and that is at the strategic level. That is to say that for all its imperfections, and for all that I, for one, have never subscribed to the federalist ideal, nevertheless, the European Union stands for a great deal more than economic mutual self-interest. It stands for parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, by and large, relatively uncorrupt public service, and all of those things which don't exist in all too many other parts of the world. And in leaving the EU with a very sort of Little Englander approach, which you'll only find on the right wing of the Tory party, if I may put it that way, we've abandoned those people in Central Europe and Eastern Europe who have never before had this kind of model of government and governance to aspire to. And that, for me, is the real tragedy of Brexit. We've abandoned those people. We've tended towards the fragmentation of the Western ideal of parliamentary democracy. And the only beneficiary of that is Vlad the Bad. For those reasons, over and above the needlessly self-inflicted economic harm, for those strategic reasons, I lament the whole exercise. I don't know whether that chimes with you.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point and a really interesting assessment, and I'd agree with it largely. I think, you know, there is a scenario or a world in which the UK could be outside of the EU but maintain strong diplomatic links, strong security links, and actually still, you know, allay a lot of the kind of concerns you've just outlined there. So I don't think it necessarily is a sort of fundamental aspect of Brexit, but I think in practice you're right that it was probably, you know, the decision to leave couldn't really have led to a different type of outcome in terms of that broader strategic picture. And it's been exacerbated, I think, by the sort of the narrative and the rhetoric, particularly from some aspects, not all, but some aspects of those who voted, not voted leave, but who ran the Leave campaigns and who have been the kind of prime movers within the government, and not just within the government, outside the government on Brexit, which has been, you know, continuously, and it will, I am sure, continue to be this way, very down on the EU, very aggressive towards the EU. You can still see it now. You know, we've left. The argument is over. The deal is done. We should really try and have a constructive relationship between the UK and the EU. It doesn't make sense to do anything else. Yet there are still, you know, hardened Brexiteers within the upper echelons of politics in the UK who keep pointing to the EU and saying it's a dying edifice, that it's a project on its uppers and it should be destroyed. I mean, I don't understand that. Why? You know, let's all move on, quite frankly. And that worries me, is this, that will be stoked, because what will happen in the next few years, I think, is we will see these problems, as I've sort of set out emerging, these economic problems emerging from Brexit, nobody will want to take responsibility for that. And so the blame will be continuously laid at the EU door. There'll be sections of the media who are very happy to support that view. So as things become difficult, it'll be, well, because the EU have made it difficult, they're being unreasonable, etc. There will be a lack, I think, of taking responsibility for the decisions that this government has made. You know, they should take responsibility for this. I don't think they will. And that'll just create bad blood between the UK and the EU. And that worries me a lot for the reasons you've set out. The UK should be a strong player in terms of security, diplomacy, etc., within the EU. And it runs the risk of not being that. That might be overly negative. You know, you do have now a Biden administration, much more multilateral. So the US is going to come back to the table, building alliances. That might make it more straightforward for the UK and the rest of the EU to kind of live in more harmony. But who knows? Who knows?
Okay, thanks very much. Any more questions? Peter Latham and then Peter Blaskos. You need to unmute.
Yes, am I on now?
Yes, you're unmuted now.
Yeah. Just trying to look on the positive side of Brexit and where we find ourselves now. We seem to have had quite a success with the rollout of the vaccine, and that seems to be, I'm not too familiar with the details of what's going on in Europe, but generally speaking, it seems to be that they've not handled it so well. Now, is this just a lucky combination of circumstances that meant Britain have ended up in a better position than Europe generally seems to be on this? Or is there something that Brexit has facilitated in some way? Or is it that merely this success might be something that we can build on in the future? Maybe the EU will learn from us, things they might do differently in the future.
I think it's a really good example, actually. It's a really good sort of case study, the vaccine issue, because I do think an aspect of it is to do with Brexit and is maybe sort of caught us a bit by surprise because it happened so quickly, a positive aspect, but it's not entirely. So the first things first, what the UK has done on the vaccine, which is to secure its own supplies and to obviously get set up and roll it out quickly, could have been done as an EU member state. So Brexit has not facilitated that. In fact, any other EU state could have done what the UK did. Indeed, the UK did it while it was effectively an EU member state. So you don't have to take it from me that it happened last year, all of that stuff, while we were governed by EU rules. So it isn't something that has been technically or legally facilitated by Brexit. Any other country could have done it. And indeed, Hungary, for example, are sourcing their vaccines from Russia, in itself quite a worrying thing, but there we go. Yeah, so you can, so it's not a Brexit thing in that sense. What I think it is, though, and I do think this is interesting, is if we had remained in the EU and this situation had arisen, then I think the UK would have played the same game everybody did, which was to pool their resources and take a common approach to the vaccine. And so we would be probably in exactly the same place as France, Germany, and others are. It's unlikely, I think, in that situation, the UK would have gone it alone in the way that it has, even though it could have done. I'm just not sure it would have. So I think there is a suggestion, which we should take seriously, that the UK now, outside of the EU, is a single country looking after itself in a sense, which I think isn't necessarily always a good thing. I think it's, could be a bit inward looking and parochial, but it does mean it can move quickly and flexibly. And the one, big problem that the EU has always had, even people who support it, is it's big, unwieldy, and bureaucratic. And things like this, quick, flexible, fleet of foot rolling out of the vaccine, don't lend themselves to big bureaucratic organizations like the EU. So I do think there is an aspect of it which Brexit has facilitated, even if it's not a legal one. However, I personally, I think the whole thing we have to be very careful of, because again, I've seen it. You see these people on sort of social media and the news and others who are sort of holding this up as the UK being better than the rest of the EU, and look at the figures on the vaccines, etc. Isn't this, you know, proof that, you know, the UK can exceed and outperform the EU because of Brexit? If you want to look at figures, you've got to look at all the figures. The UK's death figures are much worse than any other country in the EU. You know, a lot of the other things we've done on the pandemic, we've handled very badly. So I think we ought to just be more, you know, a bit humble about looking at figures and say these things are great. And I would, you know, be nervous if this was a lesson in future not to collaborate and cooperate on these things. You know, the final thing I'd say on this, I do think it's concerning that all the focus has been how wonderful our vaccine rollout has been, which it has been. It's a genuine success story. But there are countries in the world, particularly in Africa, where the amount of vaccines that they've administered are in the thousands, if not hundreds. And it just leaves a slightly bitter taste in my mouth that, you know, we should be seeing this as a competition. Who can get vaccinated? Which country can get vaccinated quickest? It's really, for selfish reasons as well, it's really important that everybody gets this right. Every country around the world, I think.
Thanks, Nick. Peter Blaskos.
Yes, I've heard enough from the doom mongers about how we got it wrong over Brexit, but let's hope it's their last gasp. On the other side of things, though, we hear that it's not just the regulations we've stumbled into, but deliberate awkwardness on the part of particularly the French importers. But are we not being rather silly in accepting the barriers when we export, which, as you say, are integral to the agreement, but not imposing them on the way back, so that we're, if you like, we have no weaponry, no leverage to negotiate with and say, hey, stop this nonsense, like changing the colour of the ink from day to day, which we hear about.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, you're right. At the moment, we are not exercising the same controls on goods coming in, but we will start to do that this year. So actually, we are going to do that. But to be honest, it's not really a sort of negotiating ploy. I think it's unrealistic to think that if and when we do that, it'll actually force the EU to start behaving better or letting stuff in. The controls of the EU, which we're seeing, and there might be the occasional bit of bad behavior and overly officious controls and checks, etc. I'm sure there are, but generally the problems that are arising are not arising because of that. They are arising because the EU is simply exercising its legal order. It's simply imposing its legal order on imports. What the UK is facing is no different than any other non-EU country is facing. They're not being particularly horrible to the UK. They're just applying the same things to the UK as they apply to everybody. And come July, we will start doing exactly the same the other way around, as we do to every other country. Ultimately, it's fair enough. You know, we want to check the goods that are coming into the UK. We want to check them for diseases. We want to check them from compliance. You want to make sure that toys coming into the UK aren't made with lead to poison our children. We have to carry out those controls. Once you're outside of the EU, those controls have moved off our legal books. You know, we had to do those things because we were legally bound to. Because of that, they moved to the border, and that's why. And we will carry out those checks the same on imports coming in. But as I say, it's not going to magically then make them go away. It is simply two sovereign blocs, the UK and the EU, exercising their legal rights to check things at their borders. That's really what it comes down to.
Okay, Jill has got a question.
What's the NFU's expectation regarding labour impacts in relation to harvesting, etc., on farms?
Yeah, great question. Again, quite serious concerns. There's a lot of non-UK labour on UK farms. That's not unusual for any developed economy. You know, we have tried many times over the years to get enough workers from the domestic workforce, and it's always proved very difficult. Even this year, with the pandemic, with people going on furlough, people losing their jobs, etc. And you would have seen over the summer there was massive campaigns to encourage Brits to take up kind of farming jobs. There was something called Pick for Britain. And that was actually partially successful. There were lots of people who did come and pick up those jobs. But firstly, still nowhere near enough. And secondly, lots of those were quite good to begin with, but they sort of dribbled away over a period of time. Brits just don't really like this sort of work, particularly the kind of really tough, backbreaking picking jobs. Some do, but most don't, and they're not particularly efficient and effective at it. That, as I say, that's probably just the indication of any developed economy. You know, you go to New Zealand, they have lots of South Sea Islanders come over and do horticultural jobs under schemes. In America, of course, there are lots of workers from Mexico and elsewhere in Central and Southern America who come and take up those jobs. This is, you know, it's fairly standard. So what we've got now is a situation where a lot of those workers came in totally freely from Eastern Europe, particularly Romania and Bulgaria, but other places as well. They're no longer able to do that. The government would say, well, now the whole world is open for us to do that, but it's not, because there's the new immigration system essentially says you have to be earning a certain salary and have certain qualifications if you're going to come into the UK to take up these jobs, and those will be above normal farming jobs. So we are concerned. Probably take a bit of a while for that to bed in because of the settled status schemes and things like this, which will mean that some EU citizens are still able to work here. But there is a specific scheme the Home Office has set up for 30,000 workers from overseas to come in on seasonal jobs in horticulture, so fruit and veg picking. So there is a recognition that there's a potential issue here, but we've only got that for 1 year, and the estimates we made of the requirements were actually 80,000 jobs. So 30,000 is obviously some way short of that. We might still be able to get more domestic workers into jobs this year because of the ongoing pandemic, etc. But in the longer term, I think, to be honest, the government's immigration policy is totally uncoordinated. I don't think they know what they want. You know, it seems to me really odd that the sorts of people they're trying to attract into the UK are high wage, high skilled workers, which sounds like you're then reserving jobs in the UK economy for lower skilled, lower wage workers, when actually most developed economies do the opposite. They move their domestic workers into higher skilled, higher wage type jobs, and they then can rely more on overseas workers who their cost of living will be lower at home. So the wages to them are relatively higher. But our policy seems to be the opposite. So, and that was a very long-winded way of saying, in summary, it is a concern, and it's not clear how exactly UK farming is going to fill its labour needs in the years ahead. But again, we'll see. Automation and innovation and things like that will be part of this as well. That's really important, that government invests in those sorts of things so that the total labour requirement is reduced.
Okay, any more questions?
Can I have another one?
Yes, you can.
So the ELM scheme is due to come in, and the question is, will that enable us, and will there be a trade problem from moving away from the CAP to ELMS? And are we going to be able to use the ELMS as creatively as environmentalists would like, in terms of moving land use away from intensive agriculture into uses with a smaller climate impact? And if we do use it that creatively, will that cause a trade problem?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, ELMS is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is replacing the subsidy system farmers in the UK have operated under for the last 45 years in the EU, which has basically been something called direct payments, related really to the amount of land that you farm. So we're moving away from that to this new system called ELMS, Environmental Land Management. It's being phased in over quite a long period of time, in the next 7 years. And it's quite unique and doesn't really operate anywhere else in the world. What the idea behind it is, farmers get rewarded for delivering environmental goods and public goods and these sorts of things, rather than for producing food. And it's interesting. It's on the face of it sounds wonderful. People go, oh, that's great. Yes, you know, and this was the sort of sell a couple of years ago. Well, why are we paying farmers for the amount of land they farm? We should be paying them to deliver beautiful environment, climate friendly farming, etc. These sorts of things. But I think we need to be a bit careful, particularly in the current situation, that we don't end up in a situation where we've incentivized our farmers not to produce food at all. And our food security suddenly looks a bit ropey, particularly, as I say, we've seen this year how important it is. But it's a really interesting area of discussion. At the moment, there's very little detail on how this will look and what it will do. Jill, like you said there, I mean, I think there's a hope that you get a perfect system that what it does is incentivize, encourage farmers to continue to produce food, but to do it in a more sustainable way, a more climate friendly way, etc. And that could be possible, but it'll require quite a lot of money from the government, maybe more than they even put into agriculture at the moment, at a time when money is tight, at a time when the UK government now has to think about what it spends on the NHS, what it spends on education, all these other things. So there is a big concern that there's just simply not going to be adequate financing. The point you made about trade, I don't think there will be an issue with elms coming a cropper of international trade rules, which is something that people fear that other countries around the world won't like the way that we are paying farmers to do certain things. But I'm not sure there is any major implications for elms and trade. Indeed, I think most countries around the world quite like the idea of a country subsidizing its farmers not to produce food. It's less competition for them. So it's unlikely to be a problem. But it's a big open question, really. I think how elms works, whether it'll achieve what its advocates think it will achieve, and we've got 7 years to find out.
Thank you. Roger Stainton's got a question about how Europe's going to evolve, I think.
Yeah, good evening, Nick, and thank you for a terrific discussion. If our economic growth over the next 4 years, or the next 4 years of this government, were to outperform that of the EU, to what extent do you see factions in certain EU countries gaining in popularity to demand a change of their relationship with Brussels and a return to absolute sovereignty?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's certainly possible. At the moment, that seems quite far away. I think even, for example, if you look at countries like Italy, where there was, a significant movement, anti-EU movement, and the populist movement there looking very closely at Brexit, very interested in it. They've now changed their tune quite a lot and are actually talking about sort of reform within the EU and remaining within it, but sort of reforming inside. And I think people have seen what we've kind of gone through over the last few years, and I think they've sort of thought maybe that's not for us, and maybe the EU, going back to the question we had about the politics of it, they made it as difficult as possible for that reason to some degree. So I think at the moment the sort of populist anti-EU movements within European countries are sort of slightly in retreat, much more than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. But as you say, I mean, if there is a situation where the UK actually begins to thrive, certainly in comparison with the EU countries, then this might come back, and that's certainly something the EU itself is petrified of happening. And I think there is a really interesting question, which we certainly haven't got time to talk about now, but about what reform of the EU would look like. Lots of people have talked about a two-tier EU, where those who want more political union could kind of go for that in the middle, and those who want a more economic trade-based relationship could do so around the outside. And that's, I think, possible. But I do think that it sort of feels quite a long way away at the moment. And I think that the suggestions you sort of occasionally read that the EU is a sort of dying project and disintegrating, I think are equally far-fetched. But I do think at some point there is going to be a reform agenda within the EU, and you may well see that two-tier approach. And what that means for the UK will be very interesting, because of course a lot of the advocates of Brexit, particularly the more sort of moderate ones, actually always quite liked the idea of a sort of two-tier, that, you know, the relationship could be economic, but not political. If you end up with that, is there then a sudden, you know, discussion around joining the outer rim? I don't know, but all to come, I guess.
An enlarged EFTA, perhaps. Yeah, thank you.
Right, there's time for one more question, if there is any. James Barry.
Can you explain what the reasoning is behind the decision that the imposition of these barriers are not going to be applied from the EU towards us until July, whereas they employed it immediately? What's the rationale behind it?
So the starting point is that those barriers should apply both ways. We are foreign countries to each other, and these are around things like what we call SPS checks, so they're food safety checks and those sorts of things. This is why these barriers exist. It's checking that hygiene is fine, that the way they be produced is fine, etc. So the starting point is actually, we're no longer part of the EU, we should be checking both ways. The UK decided not to do that, rather than the EU decided to impose the checks. It was the UK who said, actually, we're not going to for the first 3 months of the year, and then we'll start doing documentary checks at that point. And then from July, we're going to do the full physical checks. So that point in July, both sides will be doing pretty much the same thing. And the reason was because the UK essentially wasn't ready, hadn't prepared. So it doesn't have the border posts, doesn't have the border staff and personnel to carry out the volume of checks that were needed. I think there was probably also a political aspect that they know that these barriers will cause issues with supply of food and things like that in the UK when they come, and they probably didn't want to do it from 1st of January, exactly the same time as we're facing issues the other way. So they've essentially staggered it, which is probably sensible, to be honest. But as of July, currently, it could change if the UK government decides it's still not ready. But as of July, then both sides will pretty much be doing the same thing to each other's imports.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was a fascinating debate and fantastic questions, and you answered them all well. So thanks very much, Nick. Our next speaker is on the 23rd of March, and it will be Captain Gavin Edwards, who will give us an insight into the Royal Navy, another organisation that's changed in our lifetime beyond imagination. So that leaves me just to thank you all for attending, and could you join me in a toast to the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, Rotary, and health and peace the world over. It's getting longer. Cheers, everyone. So it just leaves me to say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you for hosting us, and greetings.
Thanks, Nick.